Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the latest IISS strategic dossier. I'm Alex Nichol. I'm Director of Editorial at the Institute. Over the past decade, we published a series of strategic dossiers, each of which has been the result of rigorous and independent investigation of a particular issue. Many of them have been on nuclear topics. The book that we're presenting today is on a very different subject. Indeed, as you'll hear in a moment, it's an unusual project with a unique genesis. But it very much continues the IISS tradition of carrying out rigorous and independent research. You're going to hear first from Nigel Inkster, who's Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, who oversaw this IISS project, and he will explain both how the Institute came to undertake this study and the main results of the research. And after that, your questions will be answered both by Nigel and by James Lockhart-Smith, who is an IISS Research Associate for the duration of the project and is the principal author of the book. Finally, you'll be able to obtain copies of the book and of Nigel's remarks at the end. So without further ado, over to Nigel.
Alex, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming here today. It is a rare thing for the records of an insurgent group to come into the public domain while the insurgency in question is still in an active state. But this is just what has happened in respect of Colombia, and the result is this latest IISS strategic dossier, the FARC files, Venezuela, Ecuador, and the secret archive of Raul Reyes. Specifically, this dossier is the product of over 2 years' research into the data seized by the Colombian armed forces following a raid on the 1st of March 2008 on a guerrilla camp just across the Ecuadorian border with Colombia. The camp was occupied by members of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, Ejército del Pueblo, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, known as FARC-EP or FARC, the largest of several insurgent groups that have challenged the authority of the Colombian state since the 1960s. The raid resulted in the death of Luis Edgar Devía Silva, better known by his nom de guerre, Raúl Reyes. Reyes was one of 7 members of the FARC's leadership structure, the Secretariat. Since the mid-1990s, he'd also headed FARC's overseas network of representatives and sympathizers known as the International Committee, or COMINTER. Reyes had maintained a decrypted archive of his email communications, which had mostly been sent and received using PGP encryption via an HF radio link since the year 2000, in defiance of standing FARC operational security procedures about which he himself had frequently reminded his colleagues and collaborators. His archive also contained 30 years' worth of strategic documents, including records of periodic conferences and other meetings constituting key milestones in FARC's evolution. Having seized the archive, which comprised 8 data storage devices in a metal briefcase, the Colombian authorities handed the data to Interpol, which conducted a forensic investigation to validate its integrity. The data was also triaged for actionable intelligence. The Colombian government then handed the archive to the International Institute for Strategic Studies to undertake a more detailed and systematic analysis. This proved extremely challenging, taking much longer than originally anticipated. Indeed, had we understood at the outset the enormity of the task, we might have thought twice about undertaking it. Many thousands of messages, amounting to millions of words, had to be read, made sense of, and organized in a sequential and searchable format. The CD-ROM that accompanies this dossier presents only a portion of the total archive, but still runs to 1.6 million words. The material then had to be checked against other relevant information already in the public domain before the writing of the dossier could begin. From the beginning, the Colombian government agreed that it would not seek to influence the direction of our research nor our analytical conclusions. Consequently, the judgments in the dossier are those of IISS alone. The Reyes archive offers an unprecedented insight into the origins, evolution, and day-to-day functioning of one of the world's largest and most influential insurgent groups, almost up to the present day. While the policies and behaviors of the Colombian government in respect of the long-running FARC insurgency have been reported and analyzed in extensive detail, evidence regarding FARC itself, a covert organization, has until now been much harder to come by. The archive therefore fills an important gap in our understanding of the recent history of the Andean region, while greatly expanding our understanding of the political and cultural dynamics of insurgent movements more generally. It shows how FARC, which began with a limited tactical repertoire and a strategic theater confined to remote rural areas of central Colombia, developed an ambitious roadmap to power that would seek to spread guerrilla warfare across the countryside, manipulate social and political tensions in the cities, exploit the desire of other actors in the conflict to seek peace, while itself remaining committed to securing a military victory, and obtain material and political support from beyond Colombia's borders. FARC's military impact peaked in 1998, at a time when Colombia was beginning to be spoken of as a failing state. As Bogotá began to recapture the military initiative, FARC sought to compensate by focusing on the international political dimension of its campaign, an area in which the Colombian government had struggled to impose its own narrative. Throughout the period covered by the dossier, the main objectives of FARC's international strategy remained constant. These were, first, to secure financial and military support. In this, the group was broadly unsuccessful. Persistent efforts towards the end of the Cold War to interest regimes presumed to be ideologically compatible, such as China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea, in providing sponsorship, resulted in failure and were eventually abandoned. FARC has vigorously pursued a range of alternative options with the principal aim of acquiring man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, in order to challenge Colombian air supremacy. But there is no evidence in the archive, or indeed subsequently, to suggest that any of these efforts has met with greater success. Second, to secure international political support and legitimization. Here, FARC was notably more successful. By the late 1990s, the COMINTER was pursuing political activities in 27 Latin American and European countries, and had begun to receive a sympathetic hearing from some politicians and opinion formers who proved receptive to the FARC narrative of a struggle by the dispossessed against a repressive and unaccountable oligarchy. Even when support for FARC was not forthcoming, the group was often able to make progress toward the equally important objective of generating opposition to the Colombian government. After FARC's proscription as a terrorist organization in the aftermath of 9/11, some of the group's representatives, which had taken on a quasi-diplomatic character, had to be closed down, but these were replaced with indigenous front organizations which proved remarkably effective in conducting advocacy on FARC's behalf. Third, to undermine efforts by the Colombian government to develop foreign security and cross-border cooperation. FARC worked hard to exploit tensions between Colombia and its immediate neighbors, and to persuade the latter to, at a minimum, adopt a policy of neutrality in the conflict, if not to actively promote FARC's aim of securing recognition as a belligerent. These efforts were not always successful and occasionally proved counterproductive. But over time, relations between Colombia and its Andean neighbors did undergo a progressive deterioration for which FARC can claim some credit. Fourthly, to establish and maintain safe havens in neighboring states. These served the classic military functions of providing shelter, rest and recreation, training, resupply, and redeployment. And they became all the more important once Colombia's armed forces developed greater mobility through the use of air power, making it harder for FARC to maintain fixed positions inside Colombia. The archive also shows how FARC exploited these enclaves to meet a range of actors out of reach of the Colombian state. These included political sympathizers, narcotics traffickers, members of foreign armed groups, such as ETA, who received FARC training, and arms dealers, one of whom claimed to represent the Chinese state. FARC had sought from the outset to develop relationships with successive Venezuelan governments and had had pragmatic dealings with Venezuelan security forces, which had had little option but to accommodate themselves to the arrival of violent and potentially disruptive groups which they lacked the capacity to expel by force. But it was only after the assumption of the presidency by Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez in 1999 that FARC's activities in Venezuela stepped up a gear. The genuine appeal that FARC had for Chavez was, from the first, tempered by the lack of a solid ideological bond between them. FARC's orthodox Marxist leadership was constantly frustrated by what they saw as Chavez's lack of clear ideological definition, by Venezuela's need to maintain good economic ties to Colombia, and by the political risks that contact with FARC entailed for a regime whose grasp on power was initially precarious. Nevertheless, from the beginning, Chavez, while publicly espousing neutrality and offering himself as an honest broker in peace negotiations with the Colombian government, allowed FARC to use Venezuelan territory for refuge, cross-border operations, and political activity, and effectively assigned the group a role in Venezuelan civil society. The Venezuelan government funded FARC's office in Caracas, and through the intelligence service DICIP, provided documentation and other forms of assistance for FARC operatives. FARC was also able to set up its own front organization, the Bolivarian Continental Committee. In a meeting with Reyes shortly after assuming office, Chavez further offered FARC material assistance of a kind calculated to change the military balance in Colombia, though this did not materialize, much to the frustration of FARC leaders. Following the 2002 coup, which briefly removed Chavez from power, FARC was able to exploit the ensuing climate of fear and paranoia to provide training in guerrilla and urban warfare for various armed groups that had been raised to defend the Bolivarian revolution against a second coup or even a US invasion. FARC also responded to requests from DICIP to provide training in urban terrorism involving targeted killings and the use of explosives. Furthermore, the archive offers tantalizing but ultimately unproven suggestions that FARC may have undertaken assassinations of Chavez's political opponents on behalf of the Venezuelan state. Yet Chavez continued to keep the organization at arm's length and failed to deliver fully on promises of financial and material assistance. Described by those who have taught him as a genuine strategic thinker, Chavez played his relationship with the guerrillas long, calculating that they needed him more than he them. And he was not averse to acting against FARC's interests when he judged it expedient. Moreover, in 2004, two major incidents involving FARC, which respectively angered and embarrassed Chavez, led to a total breach with the organization lasting 18 months. But by 2006, Chavez, buoyed by high oil prices and progress towards achieving his domestic and international agendas, initiated a rapprochement with FARC that saw the nature of his engagement undergo a step change. In the words of Ramon Rodriguez Chacin, a former Venezuelan interior minister and long-standing intermediary with FARC, Chavez had come to see FARC as a strategic ally in the event of aggression by the empire, i.e. the USA, but at the same time as strategic allies for the creation of a revolutionary bloc in the continent. Several meetings took place with senior members of the FARC leadership. Chavez committed to helping the group achieve political legitimacy, formally reaffirmed FARC's entitlement to use Venezuelan territory along the Colombian border, and, critically, offered to provide FARC with $300 million US, with 50 million to be made immediately available. Various options were also explored for providing FARC with the kind of weaponry, including manpads, that would alter the strategic balance in Colombia. One such arrangement, discussed a month before Reyes was killed, involved a three-way deal with President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, though at the time of Reyes' death, no such deals had been concluded and no money apparently paid. The rapprochement with FARC coincided with a dramatic deterioration in Venezuela's relations with Colombia, as Colombian President Álvaro Uribe took exception to high-profile efforts by Chavez to seek political and strategic advantage from engagement in the release of hostages kidnapped by FARC in what the group called humanitarian exchange. Chavez was not the only external actor to become engaged in these releases, and the archive shows that FARC cynically exploited them. The group's main purpose was to attain political visibility and to place the Colombian government in a bad light by seeking to impose conditions it knew would not be acceptable. Likewise, the involvement of external actors in these exchanges was, in the main, undertaken for short-term political gain, with little regard for the wider strategic consequences. Few, if any, can be said to have emerged with credit from the process, which effectively ended in 2008 when the Colombian government deceived FARC into releasing most of its high-value hostages. As with Venezuela, in the 1990s, FARC established a presence in Ecuador's border regions, which were particularly important as they backed onto the Colombian departments of Putumayo and Caquetá. These were key FARC strongholds and produced much of the cocaine on which FARC relied for income. But FARC took much longer to gain political traction in Ecuador than in Venezuela, and the Ecuadorian border region was often an uncertain, if not downright hostile place for FARC. Ecuadorian security forces generally turned a blind eye to a strong Colombian and US intelligence presence in the region, and sometimes provided active collaboration. FARC never secured Ecuadorian state support akin to what they had enjoyed in Venezuela, and their contact with successive regimes was only ever intermittent. But as Ecuadorian domestic politics shifted gradually leftwards from the turn of the millennium, FARC was able to build ties with a range of actors wielding growing influence over government policy, including Lucio Gutierrez prior to his election as president. The group had at least some contact with successive regimes and was successful in fomenting discord between Ecuador and Colombia. Reyes himself was based more or less continuously in the border region from 2003 until the time of his death, and was able to meet a range of foreign visitors and manage COMINTER affairs in relative safety. When Rafael Correa declared his presidential candidacy in 2006, FARC was initially unimpressed by his leftist credentials. But as his popularity increased and his radical potential became more evident, FARC contributed approximately $400,000 to his campaign at a critical juncture. Of this, $100,000 apparently came directly from FARC itself, and a further $300,000 from its allies. Correa almost certainly approved the use of these funds in his campaign. But this did not translate into a policy of state support for the insurgents during the brief period between Correa's inauguration and Reyes' death. The archive shows that what Correa wanted more than anything else from FARC was to be able to play a role in the group's humanitarian exchanges similar to that enjoyed by Chavez. However, although Reyes vigorously lobbied his Secretariat colleagues to afford Correa such a role, they remained unmoved. Moreover, although the death of Reyes provoked a serious breach in relations between Colombia and Ecuador, ironically a key FARC strategic objective, it also interrupted FARC's burgeoning relationship with Quito. There is no evidence that the relationship has subsequently prospered. Following the death of Reyes, FARC's fortunes have fallen to a low ebb. Colombia's democratic security policy has broadly achieved its objectives of clearing FARC from large swathes of the countryside, establishing governance and institutions where previously none had existed, and pushing the insurgents to the margins of the state. Much improved intelligence has enabled Colombia's security forces to begin decapitating the FARC leadership, and levels of desertion from FARC ranks have steadily increased. But FARC has done the one thing all insurgent groups must do. It has lived to fight another day. Despite its reverses, it shows no more disposition to engage in serious peace negotiations than at any time in its history. And although security in Colombia has improved markedly in recent years, the gains made by the government in this respect remain fragile and potentially reversible. The Colombian state faces formidable legacy challenges in dealing with millions of internally displaced persons, resolving difficult questions of land ownership, reintegrating into society large numbers of former paramilitaries, and lifting 8 million Colombians out of absolute poverty. The government is looking to refocus efforts and expenditure on economic development and social reform. But despite the post-conflict agenda, the war has not ended. Colombia's security forces continue to clash with FARC and to suffer casualties on an almost daily basis. As long as FARC continues to benefit from a degree of cross-border sanctuary and support, Colombia's development efforts will remain under threat. Thank you very much.
Well, Nigel, thank you very much indeed. Now, we're very happy to take your questions. If I call on you, please stand up and a microphone will come to you. And if that happens, then please identify yourself. Gentleman here in the second row.
Thank you. Paul McGrath from Exclusive Analysis. Question perhaps for James on how he sees President Chavez's view of the FARC now. We've seen recently a very good improvement in relations under President Santos. In fact, I think it was Semana magazine was saying that the extradition yesterday of a drug dealer from Colombia to Venezuela was a direct result of this event today, as Chavez seeks to further improve the relationship. So how do you see the future for the FARC having sanctuary in Venezuela under Chavez?
Well, I think if the archive tells us one thing, and what we've learned through this study is that Chavez is a leopard who can change his spots. We would never rule out a sea change in his policy towards the FARC. And in this respect, I think the deportation a couple of weeks ago of alias Alberto Martinez, Joaquin Perez Becerra, an important member of the FARC's international structure in Europe, is actually something qualitatively different. It's by far one of the most important actions that Chavez has taken against the group, really, in a decade. I also think reconciliation between Santos and Chavez has the potential to work out positively. But what we've seen here is a very long-term relationship developed over time and really very extensive penetration of FARC deep inside Venezuela in a number of places and relationships with a number of actors. And we've also just seen the changeability of Chavez's relationship with the FARC, the extent to which, as Nigel said, he was willing to sacrifice their interests at times for his own short-term interests, and the extent to which the FARC themselves really had no other option than to continue asking for support and remaining in the country. So I think what we'd say is cautious optimism mixed with having learnt from the archive. There is really a lot of structural problems remaining to do with the FARC's presence in Venezuela and Chavez's relations with the FARC in the long term. Those relations will now be under severe stress. He will have told them, or his ministers will have told them, we had no choice but to arrest this person, Perez Becerra, who arrived on a flight from Frankfurt. But you can see from the publications of FARC's associated front organizations that they're extremely unhappy. So this could go either way. And obviously with a publication of this timescale, it's always at a risk of things happening at the last moment.
Thank you, James. So.
Hello, my name's Hayden Warren Gash. I was ambassador in Colombia until the end of 2008. I'd just like to ask a question about the drugs dimension. I was quite surprised to see that there was very little mention of the whole drugs side of it, apart from at one point in your presentation, Nigel. And yet we know that a lot of financing came from that. It was becoming increasingly central to what they were doing. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, or whether in fact the truth is that the archives are largely silent on it.
The archive is not largely silent on it. It tracks the evolution of an attitude by FARC towards drugs, which begins with a reluctance to become involved, but eventually accepts the idea of charging a kind of tax, gramaje, on various aspects of cocaine production, but morphs over time into a kind of wholehearted engagement in the trade. Now we know, looking at the figures for cocaine production in Colombia, that once the demilitarized area that was afforded FARC in the early years of the millennium was closed down and FARC driven out from there, we saw an annual reduction in the level of cocaine production in Colombia by something in the region of 200 tons, which clearly can be attributed to FARC's inability to continue cultivation in relative peace and safety in the demilitarized zone. So drugs are a constant feature, and of course we know that in practice FARC was an asset-rich but often quite cash-poor organization, and one of the reasons that they needed to try and raise money overseas was that a lot of the time their assets were held in the form of coca leaf or cocaine base, which of course has value but can't be instantly liquidated when the urgent needs arise. So there is a lot there in the dossier which is relevant to FARC's engagement in the whole narco trade, but perhaps James would like to add.
Just a brief comment. Drug trafficking is not a driver of the FARC's behavior, it's an enabling factor. And they make a lot of their money as well from things like extortion, and you don't hear so much about that. And this dossier is really very focused on the ideological and strategic dimension of their behavior. So that's possibly the reason why we haven't really foregrounded it here. That said, what we've written about, and according to the archive, what we saw just really underscored the importance of border regions in Venezuela and Ecuador for the outflow of drugs processed or taxed or produced in some way by FARC, sometimes independently and sometimes in association with other drug traffickers.
Thank you, James. Yes, sir.
Francis McDonough, CAFOD. Do the archives tell us anything about the FARC's attitudes to relationships with the other illegal armed actors in Colombia, ELN, for example, and even the paramilitaries?
James, why don't you take that?
Yeah, they had a what it shows really through quite close focus on the relationship with the FARC, between the FARC and the ELN along the Venezuelan border region is just the degree to which those relations were extremely fractious, because they were effectively competing over corridors for the inflow of arms, outflow of drugs, etc., etc. And their relations were so bad in some areas to the extent that they began killing each other. And the archive details that in quite substantially. And indeed, President Chavez's attempts to broker a reconciliation between the two groups. With paramilitaries, perhaps less so, although in all of the raw material we saw, not everything we included in the CD with this dossier, there are quite a lot of accounts of very, very pragmatic meetings with drug traffickers and paramilitaries, very, very focused around business and perhaps with little regard for the ideological dimension.
Thanks. Gentleman in the front row here.
Alec Boyd, Venezuelan blogger. I would like to know, when will the whole archive be readily accessible by the public? And if not, why won't it be accessible by the public?
Okay, that is a complicated issue, and there are several parts to that. This is a huge volume of data, and it has taken us the time that it has taken simply to make sense of the material that we have incorporated here, which is all the material that we have found which is relevant to Venezuela and Ecuador. The only reason that other material has not been included is that it is not relevant to FARC's relations with these two countries. The rest of this we would like to be able to make available. That is certainly true, but it is a question of time and resources. This is not a cheap or easy thing to do, and unless we can find some kind of financial sponsorship to enable us to take this project forward, it will be very difficult for us to process and put into the public domain the rest of the material, but it is certainly something we would wish to be able to do.
Just hang on 1 second.
Just an additional question. Did you get complete green light from the Colombian government to do with the archive and publish as you wish, or there were some kind of editorial constraints imposed on the Institute?
No, I said in my introduction that, if I can find it, from the beginning, the Colombian government agreed that it would not seek to influence the direction of our research nor our analytical conclusions. Once the archive was in our hands, it was for us to make the appropriate judgments about how to present it and what conclusions to make. And the reason that I think, were chosen for this task is that IISS, if you will pardon slightly coarse expression, has no dog in this fight. IISS is an independent organization that doesn't really consider itself to be beholden to any government, any group, or any particular political lineup.
Thank you. The lady in the third row here. Yeah.
Hi, Laura Dixon from The Times. I just want to ask, going back to Chavez, how damaging or embarrassing do you think revelations in the archives are? Or is it just a matter of further detail to what we already knew?
Go ahead.
I think there are certain new dimensions to this which were completely unknown before. One thing we've sought to trace is the two-way relationship between Chavez and the FARC, or the Venezuelan government and the FARC. It wasn't just to do with Venezuelan support, territorial, political, logistical support to the FARC, but also about what FARC could do for Chavez. Nigel already underlined in his presentation the defensive dimension of the Venezuelan government's relationship with FARC, and possibly some of the most difficult information we've had to deal with relates to that in the aftermath of the attempted coup against Chavez in 2002. the Venezuelan regime was very frightened about how close that had come to succeeding. And the order came down to lower ranks among the intelligence and security services that the government needed to build up its paramilitary support base. That involved FARC in training a number of groups and actually the direct interactions with the DISIP, where some people were sent to Caracas to carry out terrorist activities, although we don't know whether that actually happened. So those things are completely new and completely unknown. About how embarrassing it is to Chavez, I mean, we deliberately did this blind to the consequences of what would happen afterwards. We were very much focused on the analytical dimension, looking back what had happened. So we shall see.
I think if I can add to that briefly, there's probably not a huge amount in this dossier that has not been referred to elsewhere in respect of this relationship. But of course, what is different is that this publication provides, if you like, from the horse's mouth, confirmation of allegations and claims which up until now could not be fully substantiated. And it does so in context over a period of time. A lot of the claims about Venezuela's relations with FARC, Chavez's relations with FARC, have been presented in a piecemeal, episodic fashion without what lawyers might call the exculpatory evidence. In other words, putting the whole issue out there and enabling judgments to be made in context. And that is, I think, what the difference that this dossier makes.
Thank you. The lady, sorry, not the lady, the gentleman almost at the back there.
Thank you. I'm Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business here in London. And my question is about corporate complicity, because you referred to the extortion angle. Do we learn anything about corporate complicity with FARC, not in terms of being extorted to, but actually actively supporting in some way? Thank you.
Apart from the specific instance of PDVSA, not really. Raul Reyes was not involved at the operational level in FARC's ties or contacts with business actors in the field in different parts of Colombia at all, and there's very little information on that.
Gentleman in the fourth row there.
My name is Moses from Peace College, student member of the Institute. In your presentation, you never make mention of the strategic issue of energy security. Is there any relationship in the dossier that shows that maybe there was a connection between Chavez and the FARC rebel to destroy the Colombian energy infrastructure in favor of the Colombian government in having monopoly of energy supply to the Americans?
No, that wasn't an important consideration for him, largely because underscored as part of all of this, he was having very pragmatic economic relations with the government of Uribe throughout most of this period, which were very focused on trying to co-opt Colombia into the development of Venezuela and Alba's regional energy infrastructure. If you look at events in 2004, they're very illustrative of that, the very close relationship between Chavez and Uribe on that point. So no, I wouldn't say that that was necessarily a consideration. With regard to the broader relationship of oil to this whole issue, I think that oil assumed a certain importance in being a kind of easily exportable and hard to audit commodity that could be co-opted in sort of trilateral arrangements between Chavez, the FARC, and third countries. That was typically the way these arms deals were presented, which didn't take place, but the plans were very much along those lines.
Thank you. The lady in the third row there.
Yeah. There.
Hi. Hello. It's Judith from the Spanish news agency Agencia EFE, International Newswire. I wanted to know, what indication did you find in the files that the FARC would have been prepared to participate in the assassination of Chavez's opposition? Yeah. And also, what was exactly the link and liaison between the FARC and ETA in Spain?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
On the evidence about killing members of the opposition, this is obviously very fragmentary. Nigel's comments referred primarily to the period in October and November 2002, when a small group of FARC operatives, experts in small arms assassination, car bombs, remote control detonation systems, and so on, were requested by the DISIP and sent to Caracas. We don't know what happened with that, although we collated some of the evidence on political violence from the period and put it there, but without making any definitive connection because we couldn't find any. an advisor to Ali Rodriguez Araque asked the FARC on behalf of the Venezuelan government to kill Henry Lopez Cisco in the middle of 2006. And there's no evidence that FARC took that seriously, and Lopez Cisco actually fled the country a couple of months later, not, I hasten to add, because he was saying the regime is trying to kill me, but because he was fleeing prosecution. So it really links to those specific instances.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, ETA, yes. There's substantial evidence of FARC-ETA connections within Venezuela, talking about the various plans which have already come out into the public domain about assassination, also FARC training ETA in certain techniques with the use of mortars. What there isn't is evidence of Venezuelan encouragement of those relations. You just get the impression that the Venezuelan government made Venezuelan territory a permissive environment for ETA and a permissive environment for FARC, but it didn't specifically bring them together and say, why don't you plan to kill, for example, Andres Pastrana in Spain, which was kind of the substance of their discussions. There was no official Venezuelan complicity in that we could find.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row here, did you have a question? It's Oscar. Okay, in the third row.
Christian Herbolzheimer, Conciliation Resources. You mentioned pragmatic meetings with the paramilitaries. Are there any kind of evidence of pragmatic meetings with other local actors, let's say politicians, even some sectors of security?
We obviously focused very much in Venezuela and Ecuador in this dossier, and not on the local political or security force dimension. There were some indications of that kind of activity. Again, I would stress Raul Reyes' internationally facing role. The material in the archive basically consists of everything related to the International Commission and all of the communications between the Secretariat at the top level of the FARC and then some other stuff, more strategic. So you don't find out, for example, who in Arauca specifically was cooperating or not with the FARC. It just doesn't have that kind of detail of the information.
Thank you. Gentleman there, and yes.
Thank you. Robert Monks from Janes. Excuse me. A question on the impacts of the publication this book will have regionally. Now, I see that there's been a publication this morning in the New York Times already containing some of the more incendiary analysis. How do you think this is actually going to impact on trilateral relations between Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia?
That is very difficult to know, and obviously this was always going to be a sensitive issue when it came out, but by simple virtue of the material that we were dealing with and the kind of conclusions that we were going to reach. I think it will be, well, I suspect that all parties will probably want to try and manage down the more incendiary implications of the data that has been revealed here, whether they'll be able to do so given the political pressures that are likely to emerge in Colombia, in the other countries concerned, remains to be seen. I think it is going to take a while for this to work through. As we mentioned in the report, relations between the three countries have been heading in a generally downward direction for some period of time. That descent has been halted and to some degree reversed. It seems to me that in the case of Ecuador, where there is no real evidence in the dossier that we find of a state-sanctioned relationship, the situation ought to be easier to manage, not least because when in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 raid, there was quite a lot of incendiary comment about the nature of Ecuadorian supposed complicity with FARC, which by and large we find in this dossier is not borne out by a detailed analysis of the material. In the case of Venezuela, well, as James said, we've kind of been here before. I think his characterization of Chavez as a leopard that can change his spots is a very fair one. As we know, President Santos of Colombia, having previously been vilified by Venezuela, as evil incarnate, has managed to develop quite an effective and pragmatic relationship with Venezuela. And as I said in my presentation, his primary concern is with sorting out some of the intractable economic and social problems that Colombia has been bequeathed by this period of violence. I suspect he will want to try and continue to focus as much as he can on that. I don't know how easy it will be for him.
Lady in the third row here.
Grace Livingstone, a freelance journalist. Could you talk a bit more about what the documents in the archive actually comprise? Are there emails from Venezuelan ministers? Who are they, or how high do they go? And what measures did you take to test the authenticity of the documents?
Okay, the bulk of the documents are, well, obviously apart from the strategic documents, are correspondence internal to FARC. But there do appear emails from some Venezuelan officials, especially Ramon Rodriguez Chacín. There's a whole sequence of exchanges between him and Raul Reyes from the early years. And there are a few others. It's mostly internal and has to be treated as internal, as being embedded in what FARC thought than what was necessarily the case. At the same time, we used a healthy dose of common sense when people were reporting on the contents of conversations. We think, well, do they have any reason to lie or exaggerate? And if not, they're probably telling the truth. As regards to authenticity, we were operating, obviously we began the project after Interpol had confirmed the data to be completely authentic. Interpol said straight out there had been no alteration of the files by anybody after March the 1st, although the Colombians had contravened normal forensic standards by directly booting up the devices. And as part of the research process, we really looked at everything we could find in the public domain on this, and perhaps the surprise for us was that this was not all completely new. It fitted into a long, long trail of media reporting and fragments of information here and there. And obviously the veracity of some of the archive's contents was confirmed in very strong terms in the days after it was seized by the discovery of almost $500,000 in Costa Rica, the cache of sort of depleted uranium in Colombia. Both of these things were information that had come from the archive. We didn't really have very much doubt about its authenticity at all, just caution over its objectivity at certain points.
I think it's just fair to point out also that what James has done is to weave together a picture from thousands of different communications between many people, and that's part of the value of this book. Yes, gentleman there.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Hockman. Your very interesting comments so far have tended to concentrate on the regional significance of these events, but I think I'm right in saying that the strategic significance of South America generally is increasing at the moment. And I just wondered if you have any remarks about the wider strategic implications of these events, or of what may flow from them in terms of international developments generally.
Well, I think one possible outcome will be that a number of governments and organizations who found themselves engaged in various aspects of the Colombian conflict on the basis of, shall we say, a rather inadequate appreciation of the realities of the situation might, in the light of this material, want to revise some of their thinking about the nature of this conflict, the nature of the parties engaged in the conflict. So I think that is one aspect of it, and I think that is particularly pertinent in terms of issues like peace politics. Humanitarian exchanges, as I've said, have kind of run out of road anyway, because the Colombians were able to deceive FARC into parting with most of their high-value hostages, and these have not been replaced. So I think that is one aspect of this. As you said, Latin America is starting to become much more strategically relevant now, and I think one of the issues that this dossier raises is the whole question of the adequacy of regional security institutions for dealing with the kind of conflicts and the consequences arising from it that we have referred to in this dossier. To put it bluntly, there really isn't an adequate regional security architecture at the moment in Latin America that is capable of dealing effectively with this kind of issue when it arises. And that is something that we in IISS have been advocating for some while.
Thank you. Yes, the lady there.
Thank you. Sophie Haspeslike from Conciliation Resources. I was wondering if there was any indications in the files of the potential interest of the FARC in renewed peace process or political negotiations. If there's any information on that.
Okay, we've taken quite a strong position on this because the evidence we found is really very clear that since 1982, FARC has posed as an actor interested in institutional reform in return for peace when it's actually maximalist, it's actually in pursuit of total victory. And it developed a strategy which we kind of called peace politics, really starting from 1982 onwards, whereby they tried to put themselves into the center of national political life and exacerbate what they saw as the contradictions of Colombia's capitalist society by penetrating the cities through engagement with the issue of peace and taking advantage of the interest of other actors in peace. Nothing we've seen before March 2008, when the archive was seized, indicates that anybody is seriously interested in that in the organization. Never once in all the millions of words I saw did any individual inside the FARC ever say, you know what, maybe we should give this a shot. And their focus during the Pastrana peace talks was very strategic. So what we've seen is peace as a tool, peace politics as a tool for the pursuit of total war. Now, military victory might be very far off for them now and obviously unreachable, but that doesn't affect the way they think internally and ideologically about these things.
Yeah. I think that there's a very, very telling quote which I noted down from the archive, which goes, "A truce is a form of war, not a form of peace." And I think if one compares, for example, the peace politics of, let's say, Northern Ireland with Colombia, the two things are very, very different. When the United Kingdom government engaged in peace negotiations with the Provisional IRA, they did so on the basis of some very good intelligence that gave them a high level of assurance that the Provisional Army Council were seriously interested in exploring peace. When a mediator from a third country was brought into the proceedings, there was only one mediator whose engagement with both parties was entirely consistent and transparent. In the case of Colombia, we've seen none of these factors applying. As James said, the line that comes through consistently in the evidence that we saw is that FARC had absolutely zero interest in seriously negotiating peace. Their objective, was to secure a military victory. When peace negotiations were underway, what one saw was a number of different actors trying to insert themselves into the proceedings in a very episodic and frankly rather self-interested manner, and trying to push the Colombian government into adopting all kinds of positions that they were not comfortable with. So it was a very, very different situation. And I think it's also worth recalling that shortly after President Santos took office and offered FARC an option to renew peace negotiations, FARC again imposed conditions. Let's talk about changing the entire economic basis of the Colombian state, which seemed unlikely to be accepted.
This doesn't mean that this will never happen. It's a feature of organizations under severe stress, which the FARC is under, that the leader can change his mind and suddenly all his subordinates will say, that's what I thought all along. So we're not saying this will never happen, but on the basis of the archive information, it doesn't seem particularly likely.
Okay, thank you. We'll take 3 more questions, and we'll take them as a group. So I just invite James and Nigel just to keep a note of them. First of all, the gentleman there, then the gentleman there, and then finally the gentleman in the front row. So the gentleman there, thank you.
Hello, Francis McDonough, CAFOD. Really a follow-up to the last question. Is there anything more you can say about the Pastrana peace process, and in particular, how the FARC evaluated Pastrana's approach?
Thanks. And over there. Sorry, right over there.
Calvin Middlebrook very much on the same question. Is this a conclusion in terms of FARC's commitment to serious peace negotiations, a conclusion that must in any way be qualified by the nature of the archival evidence you have and the fact that you're seeing this largely from the optic of Reyes' communications? And does he speak for the whole organization or reflect the whole organization in that regard?
Mm-hmm. And then finally, gentleman here in the front row.
Iñigo from the Spanish National Radio. Is there any mention in the files to the role of, for example, French President Sarkozy in the, intention to liberate Ingrid Betancourt or any other hostages, and any mention to that?
Thanks for those questions. Nigel, start.
Okay, well, I'll pick up on the question of, do our judgments take account of the fact that we are viewing this through the optic of Raul Reyes? Well, yes, to the extent possible, and obviously we have to work with the evidence that we have in front of us. We are aware that Reyes was one of 7 members of the Secretariat, and as we saw in the case of Ecuador and Reyes' attempts to engage Correa in humanitarian exchanges, he was not able to prevail against his colleagues in this particular instance. But as an organization, I think it's fair to say that FARC is a pretty clear example of an orthodox Marxist group that operates on the principles of democratic centralism. Key policy decisions were agreed, were accepted, and were implemented in a fairly uniform basis. So I think that in the key strategic issues, the key policy issues that form the basis of some of the strategic documents that we found in the archive, it's probably fair to assume in general that Reyes' view was emblematic of the Secretariat as a whole.
Okay, on the Pastrana peace process, well, what the FARC thought about that was very much at one with what we said in general about their approach to peace. I don't think they had much respect for Pastrana personally. They thought they could manipulate him. And it's kind of clear, this is obviously not an issue we focused on in great detail, but it's clear from the information we did see that they were very much in it for the immediate political gains internationally and also strategic inside the demilitarized zone. They were delighted that all of these dignitaries from foreign countries came to meet them, and even more delighted that they were able to send people like Raul Reyes around Europe and bolster their kind of, what at that stage was effectively a pseudo-diplomatic structure of the International Commission. So that's what I'd say about that. About their commitment to peace beyond Reyes personally, I would just second what Nigel said. It's very thorough on Secretariat communications, and there's no evidence of there being sort of political and military factions within the FARC, which has sometimes been inferred. On French President Sarkozy, again, this isn't the focus of this dossier, but he does appear here and there, or rather his emissary Noel Sayers does, negotiating with Raul Reyes for proofs of life of Ingrid Betancourt and, of course, the release of Ingrid Betancourt herself. There's no information about anything beyond an interest in the release of her, but at the same time, the sort of very narrow focus on Ingrid Betancourt and the exclusively political nature of that interest and the extent to which the French government was prepared to go in pursuit of that. For example, there's a reference in the archive to them effectively offering to expedite a visa for the daughter of Reyes in return for proofs of life of Ingrid Betancourt. But there's nothing really beyond that. It's very politically focused.
Okay, well, thank you for all your questions. This has been a very long road for both James and for Nigel and for some of our other IISS colleagues. We hope that you find the work that results both interesting and valuable. If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, you can do so on the ground floor at reception. And if you're a journalist, please see Tanya or Aisha at the back of the room. Thanks very much indeed for coming, and thanks to James and to Nigel for their presentation today.